September 29th, 2012, 3:01 a.m., Las Vegas, Nevada. Security cameras at the Palms Casino captured cocktail waitress Shauna Tiafe clocking out after another grueling shift. She looked exhausted but content, ready to drive home and finally rest. This would be the last footage ever captured of Shauna alive. Because waiting in the darkness of her townhouse was someone with a weapon. Someone who had been given a key. Someone hired to end her life. And the person who orchestrated it all, her own husband.
911 emergency.
I think I need to report a break-in and a murder. My wife is on the floor, bloody. Yep, not moving.
Those words came from George Tiafe, a respected Las Vegas firefighter, West Point graduate, and by all appearances, an upstanding citizen. But if you listen closely to that 911 call, something doesn't quite add up. His voice is too calm, too measured, and he mentions the break-in before mentioning his deceased wife. For investigators, this would be the first red flag in what would become one of the most calculated murder-for-hire plots in Las Vegas history. In 1994, at age 28, she packed up and moved to Las Vegas to be closer to her sister Paula. Sin City couldn't have been more different from her Mormon upbringing, but Shauna saw opportunity where others saw vice. She initially worked in upscale retail at stores like Saks Fifth Avenue and Neiman Marcus, but her eyes were on the lucrative casino scene. The money was incredible, and the atmosphere was electric. By 2001, when the Palms Hotel Casino opened its doors, Shauna landed a coveted position as a cocktail waitress. She absolutely loved it. One coworker later said, "I never saw Shauna with a frown or anything. She was just so bubbly and laughing at everything." The work was hard. Long shifts on her feet, serving demanding customers, but the rewards were substantial. Shauna was pulling in close to $100,000 a year in salary and tips, which were often paid in casino chips that functioned as currency in Vegas. On a really good night, she could make $500. In today's money, that's nearly $850 for a single shift. Shauna enjoyed making money, and she equally enjoyed spending it. This detail will become critically important later. It was at the Palms in 2002 that Shauna met George Tiafe. Born in September 1972, George was 6 years her junior, but carried himself with confidence that made the age gap irrelevant. His background read like an American success story. He'd grown up on a chicken ranch, lost his father young, and learned the value of hard work from an early age. That work ethic propelled him to become valedictorian of his high school class and earn acceptance to the prestigious United States Military Academy at West Point. After graduating, George served in the Army Corps of Engineers, building schools and water systems in developing countries. Noble work. But when he transitioned to civilian life, he found office-based engineering jobs mundane and unfulfilling. He craved action, purpose, the adrenaline of helping people in crisis, so he became a Las Vegas firefighter. Everyone who knew George described him as charismatic, hardworking, and genuinely heroic. He sent money home to his mother, who was caring for his disabled sister. He was even featured in a firefighter pinup calendar, playing up his all-American good looks. When Shauna met him at the Palms, the attraction was immediate and mutual. They hit it off instantly. 1 year later, in 2003, their daughter was born. 3 years after that, on March 16th, 2006, just 3 days after Shauna's 40th birthday, they married in a picture-perfect beach wedding in Hawaii. The photos from that day show a genuinely happy couple, smiling, laughing, celebrating their love with family around them. Nobody looking at those images could have predicted the horror that would unfold just 6 years later. Everything changed in 2008. The Great Recession hit America like a freight train, and Las Vegas, a city built on excess and tourism, was devastated. The unemployment rate in Vegas skyrocketed to 14%, the housing market collapsed, foreclosures became commonplace. For a city that depended on people having disposable income to gamble and party, the recession was catastrophic. George lost significant money in the housing market crash. Like millions of Americans, the Tiafes had to drastically adjust their lifestyle, and this is when the cracks in their marriage began to show. George started to change. The charming, confident man Shauna had married became jealous and controlling. He accused her of dressing inappropriately for work, calling her degrading names in front of their young daughter. Shauna was horrified. Their little girl was impressionable, and she didn't want such toxic language normalized in their home. George also began obsessing over Shauna's spending habits. Here was a woman who'd worked grueling shifts for years, earning substantial money through her own labor, and now her husband was trying to control how she spent it. The resentment built on both sides. Then there was the homeless man. George had started hiring a homeless ex-convict to do odd jobs around their house. Shauna found this man deeply unsettling. She told her sister Paula that something about him made her skin crawl, that she felt genuinely uncomfortable when he was around. George dismissed her concerns. What Shauna didn't know was that this homeless man, this stranger who creeped her out so badly, would ultimately become her killer. By April 2012, after a decade together and 6 years of marriage, Shauna had reached her breaking point. She moved out of the family home, their daughter was 8 years old, and they began sharing custody. It wasn't easy. Shauna worked overnight shifts at the casino, and George worked 24-hour shifts at the firehouse. As a result, their daughter spent considerable time with George's mother, who lived nearby. But Shauna wasn't ready to completely give up. Maybe it was for their daughter's sake. Maybe it was her natural optimism, the same sunny disposition that made her so beloved at work. Or maybe she couldn't quite let go of the dream, the handsome firefighter husband, the beautiful family they'd built together. Whatever the reason, Shauna convinced George they should try marriage counseling. They spent the summer of 2012 working on their relationship, attending sessions, trying to rebuild what had crumbled. Things seemed to be improving, or so Shauna thought. In early September 2012, something disturbing happened. Shauna's townhouse was burglarized. But this wasn't a normal break-in. Someone had entered her home, used her shower, stolen her wedding ring and a pair of bathing suit bottoms. Even more bizarrely, they'd left something behind. A pair of small men's boxer shorts that didn't belong to anyone Shauna knew. She was understandably terrified. Who breaks into someone's home, showers there, steals underwear, and leaves their own underwear behind? It felt violating. Personal, predatory, but Shauna, ever the optimist, didn't upgrade her security. She changed her locks, sure, but she believed that lightning wouldn't strike twice. She had no reason to think this bizarre burglary was connected to anyone she knew. She was tragically, fatally wrong. September 29th, 2012. Shauna clocked out at 3:01 a.m., exhausted after another long shift. She drove 30 minutes home through the quiet Las Vegas streets. She pulled into her garage, turned off the car, and entered her townhouse. She didn't bother turning on lights. She just wanted to get upstairs, collapse into bed, and sleep. She walked down the hallway toward the stairs. In the darkness, someone was waiting. Someone who'd been given a key to her home. Someone who'd been inside 20 times before, studying the layout, planning the attack. He had a weapon. He lunged. Shauna threw her hands up instinctively to protect her face. Her hands suffered defensive wounds. Then he struck her again, and again, and again. The blows were so violent, so relentless, that the weapon eventually broke. Shauna TFA died on the floor of her own home, suffering fatal head trauma, her hands injured from trying to defend herself. She was 46 years old. At 9 a.m. the next morning, George TFA called 911. He'd stopped by Shauna's place with their 8-year-old daughter, ostensibly because their daughter wanted to pick something up. That's when he discovered his estranged wife's body. Listen carefully to that call again.
911 emergency.
I think I need to report a break-in and a murder. My wife is on the floor, bloody, stiff, not moving.
The dispatcher asks when he last saw her, and George responds with oddly specific precision.
When's the last time you saw her? Right, you should go good. Take a deep breath.
I'm a fireman. I was at work yesterday, so I saw her about 36 hours ago, I guess.
He volunteered his occupation and his alibi without being asked. He's telling the story he's rehearsed, not reacting to the horror of finding his murdered wife. His voice lacks the panic, the anguish, the raw emotion you'd expect. There's no sobbing, no hyperventilating, just calm recitation of facts. For investigators, this was suspicious from the start. But George had one thing going for him, an absolutely ironclad alibi. He'd been at the firehouse all night on a 24-hour shift. Multiple witnesses could confirm he never left. He couldn't have physically committed this crime. So despite their suspicions, police had to look elsewhere. The case seemed destined to go cold. Shauna's coworkers had nothing but glowing things to say about her. She had no enemies, no stalkers, no angry ex-boyfriends, just a bubbly, hardworking woman who didn't deserve what happened to her. Investigators began to wonder if there was a predator targeting women who worked at casinos, attacking them after late-night shifts. Then, 2 days into the investigation, they caught a break. A man named William Penix, known as Big Will, came forward with shocking information. Will worked as a maintenance man and tried to help people get back on their feet. One of those people was a homeless man he knew only as Greyhound, who lived in a tent in the foothills outside Vegas. Recently, Greyhound had come to Will with a confession.
He said, I got something to tell you. And I said, well, what is it? He said, I just murdered a woman.
He didn't seem remorseful or guilty. He seemed satisfied, like he'd completed a job well done. Will immediately called the police. Initially, they were skeptical. It seemed too convenient, too easy. But they followed up anyway. They knew Greyhound sometimes stole food from an Albertsons grocery store, so they went there with Will. But they didn't need to search long. Will spotted Greyhound right there on the street. Police approached, found contraband on him, and brought him to the station. Greyhound's real name was Noel Stevens, and when confronted, he denied everything he'd told Will about killing a woman. Without a confession, police needed physical evidence. They launched a massive search for Noel's campsite, scouring miles of Vegas desert on foot and by helicopter. Finally, 8 miles from the Strip, they found it. And hidden there, half buried under a bush, was a rolled-up pair of pants. The pants were heavily stained. They tested the stain right there in the field. It was Shauna's. Noel Stevens had killed her. Confronted with this evidence during interrogation, Noel finally confessed. Yes, he'd hidden in Shauna's house. Yes, he'd attacked her when she came home from work. Yes, he'd beaten her to death. The injury to her head was so severe that paramedics initially thought she'd been shot. The medical examiner would later describe the injuries as some of the most severe he'd ever seen. But the confession raised more questions than it answered. Why would this homeless man even know who Shauna TFA was? Why would he want to kill her? What possible motive could he have? Police examined Noel's cell phone, and there, buried in his call log, was a number that made their blood run cold. It belonged to George TFA. When they asked Noel about it, he said casually, "That's my friend, the firefighter. He pays me to do work around his house." Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Noel was the homeless man George had hired, the one who'd made Shauna so uncomfortable, the one she'd complained about. Her instincts had been screaming at her that this man was dangerous, and she'd been absolutely right. But how deep did George's involvement go? The phone records provided a stunning answer. In the month leading up to Shauna's murder, George and Noel had called each other 87 times. This wasn't a casual employer-handyman relationship. This was constant communication, planning, coordination. On the day of the murder, Shauna's sister Paula had called George after hearing the news.
Hello?
George,
Yeah,
this is Paula. Can you tell me what's going on?
Shauna passed away.
And what did they do to her?
I don't know, just laying on the floor with blood.
Paula's husband had the presence of mind to record the call. George sounded distant, detached. When Paula told the grief counselor standing with George that she suspected George might be involved,
No one else can hear what I'm saying, correct?
Correct.
I have my suspicions that her husband may be involved in this.
it wasn't taken seriously at first. After all, George had that perfect alibi. He'd been at the firehouse all night. Dozens of people could confirm it. But what if George hadn't pulled the trigger himself? What if he'd hired someone to do his dirty work? As investigators dug deeper, the full scope of George's plot emerged. It was elaborate, methodical, and absolutely chilling in its calculation. George and Noel had first met when they lived on the same street before Noel became homeless. Noel had lived with his sister just a few doors down from George and Shauna. George was charismatic and successful, everything Noel wasn't. Noel idolized him. So when George offered Noel $600 up front with thousands more to come if he killed Shauna, Noel agreed. They discussed multiple scenarios. At first, they talked about staging a car accident. Noel would strike Shauna, put her in her car, and crash it into a wall. But an autopsy would reveal the head wound first, raising suspicion. They considered suffocation, but Noelle worried about getting scratched and leaving his DNA under her fingernails. George even drew up a map of the Palms Casino parking lot, showing where Shauna parked, suggesting Noelle attack her there. Noelle actually climbed the wall into the parking lot one night, but was scared off by the heavy security presence common at casinos. Finally, they settled on Shauna's townhouse as the location. George gave Noelle a key to the place. Noelle used that key to enter Shauna's home approximately 20 times, studying the layout, planning his attack. One of those times was the burglary 3 weeks before the murder, when he showered in her bathroom, stole her wedding ring and bathing suit bottoms, and left behind his boxer shorts. It was a dry run, a practice session. Surveillance footage from Lowe's showed George and Noelle shopping together weeks before the murder. They purchased a hammer, a knife, and gloves. Noelle later led police to where he'd buried the murder weapon. The handle had indeed broken from the force of the blows. It had a barcode that matched the Lowe's purchase. The most chilling detail? Noelle told investigators that leaving the garage door open was the signal he and George had agreed upon. When George saw the open garage door, he'd know the job was done. And then George brought his 8-year-old daughter to the scene. He let his own child see her mother's lifeless body. What kind of monster does that? On October 8th, 2012, 9 days after Shauna's murder, investigators confronted George's family with all the evidence they'd gathered. His family was horrified and disbelieving. After that meeting, George's sister called him, presumably to warn him the police were closing in. George dropped his daughter off at his mother's house. Then he got in his truck and sped through city traffic onto Somerset Parkway. He accelerated to a high speed and drove directly into a barrier. There were no skid marks. This was a deliberate attempt to end his life. But George survived because he'd been wearing his seatbelt. Even in his attempt to end his own life, some instinct for self-preservation kicked in. Lying in his hospital bed, George TFA was formally charged with murdering his wife. Noelle Stevens pleaded guilty in 2013 and agreed to testify against George in exchange for prosecutors not seeking the death penalty. This meant everything would hinge on whether jurors found Noelle credible. He had a stutter that worsened under stress. He admitted to experiencing hallucinations. Even Big Will, his friend and mentor, confessed that sometimes he didn't believe what Noelle said. But Noelle took the stand anyway. He admitted breaking into Shauna's house as a dry run. He described how George told him to make it look like a robbery, and he recounted the most haunting detail of all.
What happens when you come out that door and you're holding that hammer?
She tells me why I'm doing this.
She says, "Why are you doing this?"
Yes,
Who told you to kill Shauna?
George.
George didn't take the stand in his own defense. His only character witness was his sister, who testified about what a peaceful, good person he'd always been. It wasn't enough. The evidence was overwhelming. The phone records, the surveillance footage, the murder weapon with the Lowe's barcode, the key to Shauna's house, Noelle's testimony. On September 3rd, 2015, George TFA was found guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole in December 2015. Number 14. In 2017, George attempted to appeal his conviction. He wrote a 100-page handwritten petition himself after his lawyer quit the case. His appeal argued that his attorney had been ineffective. More bizarrely, George claimed he'd been taking pain medication for an injury sustained as a firefighter, and under the influence of these drugs, God told him he needed to kill Shauna to protect his daughter. The court's response was withering. They noted that George had plotted the murder over weeks while working his regular shifts, caring for his daughter, and attending marriage counseling with Shauna to avoid any suspicion related to her death. They wrote, "Given the patience, subterfuge, and perseverance involved in this plot, the appellant has not demonstrated a reasonable probability that he would not have been convicted or would have received a more lenient sentence." The appeal was denied. George TFA would spend the rest of his life behind bars. So why did he do it? Investigators believe it came down to money and control. During their investigation, they discovered George had been trying to hide assets through his mother. The tensions in the marriage had started with the Great Recession and consistently revolved around Shauna's spending. George, the West Point graduate who'd served his country and saved lives as a firefighter, couldn't stand that his wife earned good money and spent it as she pleased. He couldn't control her, and in his twisted mind, if he couldn't have her on his terms, Nobody would. There's another theory. George knew that in a divorce, Nevada's community property laws would require splitting assets 50-50. Shauna made substantial money. A divorce would be expensive, but if she died before they legally separated, George would inherit everything. Her death solved his financial problems and gave him complete control over their daughter's life. In 2023, George and Shauna's daughter graduated high school. She's been living with her paternal grandmother ever since that horrible day in September 2012 when her father brought her to the scene of her mother's murder. She was 8 years old when she lost her mother to a brutal killing and her father to prison. Now she's a young woman trying to build a life despite the horrific legacy she inherited. One can only hope she has the support, love, and therapy needed to process such unimaginable trauma. This case reveals something deeply unsettling about human nature. George TFA wasn't a career criminal or a violent sociopath with a long history of abuse. On paper, he was a hero. West Point graduate, Army veteran, firefighter, the kind of man we're taught to admire and trust. He saved lives professionally while plotting to take one privately. If you listen to that 911 call now, knowing what we know, it's chilling. Every word was calculated. The mention of the break-in to suggest an outside intruder, the immediate establishment of his alibi, the oddly specific timeline, the lack of genuine emotion. George thought he'd planned the perfect murder. He had an ironclad alibi, a disposable hitman, and a narrative that would point investigators toward a random burglary gone wrong. But he made critical mistakes. He underestimated Big Will's moral compass. He didn't count on Noelle feeling the need to confess. He left a trail of evidence, phone records, surveillance footage, the murder weapon. Most importantly, he failed to understand that investigators see through fake emotion. That 911 call alone would have kept him under suspicion, even with his perfect alibi. Shauna's sister Paula knew something was wrong immediately. Women's intuition isn't magic, it's pattern recognition. Paula had heard things in conversations with Shauna that set off alarm bells. She tried to warn the grief counselor that very first day, trust those instincts. If someone makes you uncomfortable like Noel made Shauna uncomfortable, listen to that internal warning system. It exists for a reason. Shauna TFA was a bubbly, hardworking woman who loved her job, loved her daughter, and died trying to protect herself from a brutal attack in her own home. She made good money through her own labor, enjoyed spending it, and had every right to live her life on her own terms. She didn't deserve to die because her husband felt entitled to control her. No one does. George TFA sits in prison today, right where he belongs. Noel Stevens is there too, a homeless man manipulated and exploited by someone he admired. Someone who convinced him that human life could be bought for a few $100s and a promise. And somewhere, a young woman is living with the knowledge that her father murdered her mother. That's the real tragedy here. Not just Shauna's death, but the generational trauma inflicted on an innocent child who lost both parents in one terrible act of violence. We want to hear from you. Have you ever had instincts about someone that proved correct? Have you or someone you know escaped a dangerous relationship? How do we better protect people like Shauna, who did everything right, separated, sought counseling, changed locks, but still fell victim to someone determined to hurt them? Share your thoughts, your experiences, your insights in the comments below. These conversations matter. Your voice matters. Stay vigilant, trust your instincts, and remember that appearances can be devastatingly deceiving. Until next time, stay safe, and we'll see you on the next case.